So I have essentially two sort of different strands of research that are actually connected by Russia, as it turns out. But I'll first sort of tell you, I'll do this in chronological order. So my background is as a political scientist who studies post-communist political behavior. Which means that I'm interested in how ordinary citizens interact with politics, and I've been particularly interested in how this has played out in post-communist countries. So in the early years, that was sort of how political behavior was developing in either new democracies or transitioning autocracies, but all in the aftermath of the collapse of communist rule. As someone who does political behavior, I was interested in voting, so how post-communist citizens were voting, interested in the development of partisanship, how these citizens began to think about political parties, interested in public opinion formation, so how people formed opinions about political issues, and also interested in mass mobilization and protest, which I got particularly interested in around the time of the colored revolutions. Now, unlike a lot of the other people at the Jordan Center who come at this from a very sort of Russia-exclusive focus, my research has always been sort of broadly based in post-communist politics. So my first book was on how the economy affected election results in Russia, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia in the 1990s. So it was one of the first kind of explicitly comparative studies comparing politics in Russia with politics in Central and East European countries. And it was also one of the earlier studies of sort of the types of political behavior studies that had been done in Western countries and established democracies. It was one of the first sort of studies to be done in this sort of framework in the sort of post-communist politics. My most recent book was on how communist era legacies affect attitudes among post-communist citizens towards democracy, markets, social welfare, and gender equality. So again, broadly based in post-communist, where Russia is a part of it, but we're looking at the effect of communist-era legacies across the post-communist world, including both the former Soviet Union and East Central Europe. The most interesting thing I've learned from my research on post-communist political behavior was that this project where we went in to study the effect of communist-era legacies on attitudes among post-communist citizens, what I really, really thought we were going to find was that once you adjusted for conditions on the ground, that would explain why citizens in post-communist countries were, for example, less supportive of democracy, less supportive of markets, and more supportive of state-provided social welfare. So I thought what we were going to find, for example, was that there was a relationship between economic conditions and support for market economies. And that this was a relationship that was sort of constant around the world, but whatever the factors were, so imagine the situation is such that like your economy craters, less people are going to support market economies. Or when the economy goes down the tubes, less people are going to be supportive, fewer people are going to be supportive of democracy. There'll be less support for democracy. And then, if you were to look cross-nationally, if economic conditions were worse in post-communist countries in the 1990s, that would explain why it was the case that there was less support for democracy in those countries, or something along those lines. I was really convinced that that was what we were going to find in this study. Our alternative theory in the model, in the book, in this first theory we called like living in a post-communist country, that it would be, yes, there could be differences in attitudes, and even the characteristics that cause those differences in attitudes might have been a result of the communist experience, but that it would generally be driven by these conditions on the ground. What we found in our book, which is called Communism Shadow and was published in 2017 by Princeton University Press, was that actually our alternative hypothesis was that maybe it had something to do with the experience of living through communist rule. We found that there was much stronger empirical support for that second hypothesis, that we were actually able to look at how many years people had lived under communist rule. And it turned out that additional years of living under communist rule were associated with more of these attitudes. Less support for democracy, less support for markets, more support for state-provided social welfare. And so that was a big surprise to me. And that's kind of I think that's sort of the fun of doing research, is that you can go into a research project with one explanation in your head, which you think you find more credible about the way the world works, and then you can learn a second explanation which comes out afterwards, which turns out, no, the world actually works in a slightly different way from what you yourself as the researcher thought was going to be the case before you started.